Hi everyone. Welcome to our third episode of The Open Shelf. I'm really excited on this episode. We have multiple surprises for you. First and foremost, we are going to discuss about one of my most favorite books when it's come to leadership and management. This is Radical Candor: How to be a kick-ass boss while not using your humanity. I love the title as well. And this is about experience of Kim Scott, which she have had really great work experience working in Google, Apple, and really engaging with really people, influential people like Andy Grove and CEO of Twitter, and several more, which we are going to deep dive within this episode. And we are really honored that we have our honored guest Amy with us today. I'm gonna pass to Amy to give us a little bit of introduction about herself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Sandler. I am the principal coach and the podcast host at Radical Candor. We also have a podcast featuring Kim Scott, the author of Radical Candor, and the co-founder of our company, Jason Rosoff. So I work at Radical Candor. It's not just a book, it's a company. It's an idea, it's a philosophy. We train, deliver workshops, keynotes around the world. I've been at Radical Candor for over 7 years. I've been the chief marketing officer, the chief content officer, and now focusing primarily on overseeing our Train the Trainer and delivering lots of keynotes and workshops and chatting with good folks like you, Mady, and potentially your other surprise.
Great. We are really honored to have you on board. Another surprise that we have in this episode, uh, Tobias was not able to make it, and Willem stepped in. Willem, please give us a little bit of introduction and tell us what do you think about this episode and this book.
Oh, brilliant, Mary. Thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's an absolute pleasure and quite an honor to step in. I mean, unfortunately, Tobias going to be here, but I think we're going to have a lot of fun this afternoon. So, for me, Radical Candor was interesting in that it's very hard for me to find books that actually invoke a visceral experience as you read it. And I think as Kim was writing this, so much genuine emotion that comes over in the book. It's very hard not to feel some of the chapters a little bit more. I think it's you do get a little bit of flashbacks from your IT career way back when, where you go through some of these characters. So I'm just absolutely excited to talk a little bit about the book and pick Amy's brain, more likely than not.
Great. Yeah, this is absolutely one of my most favorite title when it's come to leadership and management. As Willem mentioned, there are stuff that you can correlate in day-to-day basis. And what makes this book so special, the things that Kim mentioned, it's easily applicable on day-to-day tasks that you're doing, and you can see and correlate the mistake that you did. Yeah, I did this mistake as well, and wow, such an easy solution. And the narrative that it have, the storytelling that she have, it make it in a way that stick with you. You don't forget it in a way after a year or two. No, still you remember those really nice story that she mentioned it within the book.
Yeah, I love that you both bring up these stories. Kim and I actually went to business school together. I did not know Kim at the time, and then Kim went on to have great success in Silicon Valley and all those amazing jobs. I went on what I would call the income minimization path, where after Harvard Business School, I got my MFA in screenwriting at UCLA in California. And then I became a meditation teacher. So if you're looking to make lots of money, don't necessarily follow the path. But what I will say is that, one of the things that I think is so powerful about both Kim's work and also the work that we do at Radical Candor is exactly what you're talking about, is storytelling, is connecting through emotion, through very relatable, it's not sort of these faraway things. I think we can all relate to it. We all can be better leaders. And I think it taps in, Willem, you mentioned about sort of that emotional experience. I mean, that's really, I think why it's so sticky is because we realize these are the hard moments of, should I say it? why am I not saying it? What is the cost of not saying it? And so I think it's through those stories, it really illuminates very universal truths.
Yeah, exactly. One of those story that I it's really was something that was a stick with me. I was always using it as an example when I wanted to uh, uh, talk to people in that category. Was Bob's story when she had this really nice hire, but and with nice resume, but he was not up to the mark. But because he was so nice, and she didn't want to look bad, she did not give any feedback to him. And everybody was trying to fill up for this fellow up until it reached to the point that Kim needed to fire him. And the first reaction Bob had, why I should hear this now, why I did not have any feedback. Like, this was something that she said it was big mistake from her end, and uh, learn from it that, hey, when you need to give a feedback, it's really important, not only from your end, from the company end, from that person end as well. So it should not, never should come as a surprise for them when they get to that stage. It should come in a way that, hey, I give you this feedback over and over again, and there is nothing changed, and it should not be a surprise.
Yeah, the Bob story is really powerful. I think, we all sort of have our versions of that, both of being in Kim's shoes and probably also being in Bob's shoes. And neither of those are good shoes to be in. And, we call that mistake ruinous empathy. And, empathy is foundational to the practice of radical candor. So just to kind of define what we mean by radical candor, it's this idea that we can care about the people we work with as, real human beings. At the same time, we're willing to challenge them directly. So it's this idea we can, give kind and clear feedback. We're caring and we're challenging. The reason we call it radical candor is because it's rare. The meaning, the sort of the root meaning of the word radical, it's rare that we do both. We tend to do either one of them, like we're caring so much about Bob, we don't want to hurt Bob's feelings, right? Or we end up just challenging Bob and yelling and landing in what we would call obnoxious aggression. And so, one of, I think, Kim's gifts as both a writer and just a strategic thinker is her ability to communicate complex ideas in a simple way. And so one of the things that people love the most, for people who haven't yet read the book or gone to our website, is this idea of like a 2x2 framework. So if you think about sort of care personally as sort of the vertical axis of a 2x2 framework, and challenge directly is the horizontal. We joke that, if you worked in consulting or went to business school, just, throw any difficult problem into a 2x2 matrix, like that's the secret. So just care, challenge, 2x2 matrix, right? So there's your quick and dirty MBA program. I just saved you 100,000 US dollars. I don't know how much in Europe. But so if you think about, like, that's radical candor, kind of the top right. I'm caring and I'm challenging. The mistake that you were making with Bob would sort of be, in our framework, the top left, which is that it's high on the care, but it's low on the challenge. And I would say this is the mistake we tend to see most, certainly the mistake that I tend to make the most. But I think it's really important to note, as we go through the framework and we can talk about it more, we all make these mistakes all the time. Like, even in one conversation, like, I might go from ruinous empathy and then I might get so frustrated I start yelling at the person, and I'm now over an obnoxious aggression. And then there's the bottom left quadrant, which I would say, is perhaps the worst place of all, both to be in for ourselves and for cultures, because we call this manipulative insincerity. This is when we're not caring, we're not challenging, and this is the meeting after the meeting. You say one thing to the person, love your podcast, love, Amy, I love going to your Radical Candor workshop. And then, afterwards in the hallway, oh, that was terrible, et cetera, right? That sort of, one thing to the meeting after the meeting. In its worst, this can look like, backstabbing, very political behavior, right? But part of what we do, and I can share my own stories as well if it's helpful, and I'd love to hear your stories. we share stories when we've landed in each of these quadrants because we really try to normalize, like, we all make these mistakes. To your point, Willem, like just at the top, like we all can relate to it. And I think when we sort of talk about the mistakes that we've made, what's underneath it, then not so simple, right? Like what's really happening under the surface. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I completely agree with you because as I was going through the book, I definitely found myself living each of these quadrants as well. I mean, there's been yeah, the manipulative insincerity one is always such a tricky one for me to sort of navigate because you do get certain personalities that you're just not equipped to handling that to a certain extent. Um, Obnoxious aggression. I just love the anecdote with regards to someone cutting you off, and instead of just yelling at them, maybe just like give them the reason on why you are mad. And then if they don't care, then you can start yelling. It's absolutely beautifully said. And that is also like one of the things for me that I need to sort of rationalize as well is I come from a very collaborative culture as a South African where, these very different people working together within a company gives you a very sense of um, it's more about like a communal respect and friendliness, but then sometimes that friendliness just pushes it a little bit too far, and you're so solidly into that ruinous empathy quadrant.
Yeah.
We just feel so hesitant to give that very critical feedback. And yeah, it's kind of nice to read something like this, and I think it's the right kick in the bum to sort of just push you over the line to say like, hey, listen, it's not fun, it's not great, but oh hell, it's so needed at some point in time, and it's good for not just for you, but for the people that you're talking to as well. I mean, that's my personal experience that I've felt.
100%. No, I mean, I teach this to hold myself accountable to practicing it because it doesn't feel good to not have people tell you something and to be like Bob. And I had a very similar situation where I had a guy who worked for me, and 9 times out of 10, he would go above and beyond. And we actually also had a good friendship as well. And we had a new boss come, and I was
Mhm.
working. This was before all the video conferencing, and so I was in a different office, and I started hearing from this new boss, oh, this direct report, he's yelling in meetings, he's throwing things, you have to fix it. And at the time, not really liking conflict, I would kind of avoid it and be like, I know everything's so stressful. I get it. It's so hard. And then months pass and months pass. And then we have this offsite, and the new boss had paid a lot of money for a speaker. The dress code was like, business dress. And this
Mhm.
person showed up in shorts, and he started yelling at the speaker. And my boss stopped the meeting and said, Amy, this has to stop or he is out. So I had to have that very similar conversation to Bob where I had to tell him. And he, again, rightfully so, was like, why did you not tell me? And, what I think is again, this really motivates me as someone who does care. If I
Mm.
really cared, I would have told him. And I think if you go back to that framework, and we can talk about some of the other mistakes, but if you think of high care, low challenge is ruinous empathy. So I'm worried about his feelings. So yes, part of me was worried about his feelings. And if I'm really honest with myself, there was manipulative insincerity going on where I was worried. I didn't want to deal with his emotional response. I didn't want, I wanted everyone to like me, right? The sort of people. So it was much more about me and how I thought people would, think of me, and not wanting to deal with that emotion. And so
Mm.
I think what's very interesting with the framework is that in terms of the mistakes, the only other mistake, the only other sort of quadrant where the person knows what's wrong is obnoxious aggression. Now it's a mistake because
Yes.
I would have said, "Hey, in this case, Brooke, like you're acting like a jerk. Shape up or ship out in front of everyone
Yeah.
else." Like he would have known what the problem was, but it would have destroyed the relationship. And so I think what's very interesting on that other side, that sort of ruinous empathy and manipulative insincerity, where we're not challenging, it's kind of an inside job. Why am I not telling them? And very often, we will do a poll where we will ask folks in a workshop, which mistake do you tend to make the most? Again, knowing that we all make these mistakes. And typically, what I would find, and I'll be curious if this kind of maps up with you all, is we would have more people self-identify with ruinous empathy. And then I'll ask, knowing there's no like absolute measure, just sort of your gut assessment, which mistake do you experience most at work? And I'm curious, like, where do you think the results would tend to fall? What do you think might change, if anything?
Mary, you take this one, sir. Let
Any
you start.
ideas?
Uh, I think it's going to obnoxious aggression.
Yeah, sometimes there's definitely more obnoxious aggression because, I think a really important point, which I haven't named yet, is that there is no absolute measure of radical candor. So even Willem going into coming from South Africa, a certain culture, very collaborative, whether it's our sort of geography, our culture, generational differences, we're kind of coming to all of this. But each person is going to measure what is being said. It's much more about not what I think, oh, I was being radically candid as the speaker. No, what matters is how did it land for the other person. And that's going to depend on who they are, our relationship. Also, by the way, you might say something to me at 8 a.m. in the morning. I've got a lot of energy that could land as radical candor. And by 5 p.m. at the end of the day, that could land like obnoxious aggression, right? Like just think about it, right? So even in one day, same person. So that's kind of thing one, is that there's no absolute measure. But what we found, so in addition to A, yes, more obnoxious aggression, B, a lot more manipulative insincerity. So I think I'm not telling you because I know I don't want to hurt your feelings, but how is it landing for the other person? Just this sense like nobody told me, or they didn't tell me for 6 months, or, oh my gosh, or like people talking about me. I just sort of have this feeling like, did I mess that thing up? I don't know. No one's telling me, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I absolutely agree. It's so interesting for me. I think one of the quotes that really stuck with me is the whole fact that it's something that's measured not when you deliver it, but when it's essentially received. And it involves actually so much effort just to be able to understand people to that extent that you can sort of uh, just have a gut feeling with regards to how far you should lean in both ways. It's also one of the things that I really appreciate from the framework as a whole, and not just the book itself, is that it seems, and you could tell me if I may be wrong here, but it seems to focus on a very healthy way to get those things that you normally bottle up that pushes you towards the obnoxious aggression just out in little bits before it becomes a big problem, right?
Yes,
Exactly.
Mady, I see you nodding. Anything more you want to add before I jump in?
No, I totally agree with Willem and the way that Kim illustrate each and every one, every point that hey, what each quarter look like, and illustrated with one really nice example and a story. It's mind blowing. One thing that, and she was like giving an advice that catch people in an act. You want to address the work, not the person. If the work is bad, not the
Hmm.
person. And it's really difficult way of doing things because you want to address the work, but sometimes people they have tendency to take it personally because of time of the day, what they have been through, and so many other factors. It's really difficult. And what Kim was also mentioning, like sometimes Steve Jobs was mentioning, your work is shit. And when they asked him to elaborate, he said, I'm saying your work is shit, and sometimes I'm wrong.
Yes, and he was definitely at the far end of things, right? And I think there are a few things that you're both saying that are really important. One is that when we are starting to put radical candor into practice, there's kind of like an order of operations. If we're going to want to build, like for me, this is about building more trusting relationships with people. So kind of thing one that we want to do, especially if we're managers, especially if we've got some power, but any relationship start not by giving criticism, but actually by asking for feedback, especially criticism if we do have some power, because we have to kind of level the power playing field. And I think one of the really interesting things, and Kim talks about this in the book too, is like, we don't necessarily think of ourselves as like, now I'm like the big boss with all this power. Like, we might not see ourselves that way, but the very act, especially if we are a manager or have some other form of, maybe systemic power, et cetera, people may be treating us differently. And we might not think we're intimidating, but that might be how it lands. And again, it goes very much to the sort of difference of intent versus impact, which is like my intent is to be helpful, but to actually understand what that looks like for someone. So we want to start by asking for feedback. And we also want to be giving a lot more praise than criticism. And because radical candor is really all about painting a picture of what's possible. So one of the things I want to do too is like share stories of what good looks like, not just like the fails, but actually like where are we going? Because we want to paint a picture of like, what does radical candor look like? And by the way, it's going to look different for each of us. And so again, part of it is to understand with the people that we work with, one of the reasons why storytelling is so powerful, we'll do this exercise where it's like, hey, like, let's say I'm just starting to get to know you all. I'll be like, tell me about a boss you had, that you really worked well with. Like, what did they do? Tell me a story about a time they shared feedback with you. Like, where was the care? Where was the challenge? Because we start to learn a lot about kind of what good looks like either in the moment or if they tell some stories. So that's kind of thing one is sort of the order of operations. But I also want to go to, Willem, what you were saying. Very often, because we're kind of afraid of having these conversations, to your point,
scary.
It's scary, and we build it up and we build it up and we build it up. And, in some ways you can think about the challenge directly dimension on one side is kind of silence and the other side is rage, because then we built it up and built it up. And by the time we do it, we're like, and she has this story, I think it's about, Slovakia and Slovenia, and this guy and her team kept making the mistake, and she was like, couldn't take it. And she's like, it's Slovakia, So I think part of what we want to do is have this become much more frequent, that it's like brushing and flossing rather than a root canal. And I think it's really important for us to think about, and one way that I like to do this is I like to bake in, like, let's say I have, in a meeting, like, we'll just leave like 5 minutes at the end where we can check in and say, hey, this worked really well. Or, and it just, giving praise, or if there's something that popped up, just to kind of nip it in the bud, so that that's just something we do so that it doesn't become this kind of big thing. And a lot of times it becomes a big thing, A, because we're nervous, but B, because like, we're so busy and we're like, they're smart, they'll figure it out. And then was it a big deal? And I'm so busy. And then what happened? And then they keep making the same mistake. And then we're like, oh crap. And then they find out I've been making this mistake for 6 months and you never told me.
Oh, because life also happens.
Yeah, life.
Right.
And it's so much easier to not say it. And so I think part of this, and we were talking about this a little bit at the top, Willem, is like, how to make this more of a practice, how to, let's make it again more like this kind of, because it's behavior change, and it's going to be a lot easier to not say it than to say it. And so if we can just start to agree, and for me, again, this is why I teach it, because I'll share a quick story. I don't know if you all are familiar, there's a US, improvisation, like improv comedy. There's a group called Second City based out of Chicago in the US. And a lot of like Saturday Night Live people, famous comedians. And we had a partnership with them. And so we did these shows called Improvising Radical Candor. And it would be really fun so that people could, we'd have like make the mistakes and people would throw in, different ideas. And so we were just about to go on stage, and one of the improvisers, I had just met him. He came out of the men's room and his fly was down. And so my first response to myself was, somebody's got to tell this guy his fly is down, right? Like, it was like, it's not going to be me. And I said to myself, Amy, first of all, you're teaching radical candor. And second of all, there is literally no one between this guy and the audience. So I pulled him to the side. He was an improviser, so of course he was hilarious about it. But I share this because it's such a small moment, but that sort of the voices in our head of like, somehow he's going to figure it out. And the reason why I also want to share it, before we do our podcast, before we go on stage as an improv, you say to each other, got your back. I'm like holding up my hands, but I don't know if I can. And the idea is that if we're going to go on stage, we've got to trust that if I make a mistake, the other person's going to pick it up for me. Or if I'm doing something great, the other person's going to support me. And so how do you build trust, but that sense of got your back? I'm going to tell you what's working well. I'm going to tell you where you're messing up.
That is really amazing. And regarding this story of Slovakia and Slovenia, she was mentioning about building relationship over the year, that she were so comfortable to call her colleague dumbass. It's Slovakia, not Slovenia. But she was mentioning this is not something that you can do unless you make the relationship first. And building that relationship require years of effort, and it's require also culture come as prerequisite for it, because she was mentioning that a relationship might not scale, but culture will do. But
Yes.
what make the culture is the relationship.
100%. We talk a lot about that idea of relationships don't scale, but culture does. And what we mean by that is, I can't necessarily, if I have a team of, like Kim had, teams of thousands at Google, there's only so many of these one-on-one relationships that you can have with your direct reports. We get sometimes questions from, people, I've got 30 direct reports. There's only so many hours in the day. So part of it as a manager, certainly those one-on-one relationships with your direct reports, and then they have their relationships with their direct reports, and that's how the culture can start to scale. But I think it's really important to talk about relationship building, Mady. It's such an important point, because part of what we're also trying to show people is that you can actually build trust through practicing radical candor. And so the idea with the Slovenia, Slovakia, she had built that relationship so she could very immediately go out on the challenge and, have some humor with him, et cetera. But to your point, if I'm just meeting you, I'm not going to call you dumbass, certainly. I need to, like, those sort of dimensions of care and challenge, they have lengths, right? And so it's really important that we start by anchoring on the care. And so one of the ways, in terms of relationship building, again, it goes back to that sort of order of operations. One of the best ways to build that care is by asking for your feedback, rewarding your candor, giving you specific and sincere praise. But even in a moment, I was traveling a few years ago. I was in Toronto, Canada, and there's a lot of weather. There was a lot of snow, and I was supposed to go to Idaho, which is another very kind of snowy part in the U.S., and my flight was canceled. This was before I was working at Radical Candor. I was teaching mindfulness to CEOs, and I had 2 CEO groups the next day. And the CEO who kind of was organizing led the groups. I had to call him from the airport and tell him, like, I'm so sorry, like, I'm not going to be able to make, and I never miss a thing. And, so
Yeah.
would that have stressed, you seem like the kind of guys that would also have been hard for you, right? So, I mean, I right? Like, you want to do a great job. And so I called him. I was so nervous, like I'm in the airport, the flights, I don't know what's happening, the noise in the background. And he said, I'd never met him. He said, Amy, the most important thing is that you're safe. Take care of yourself. And I could tell, like, across the phone, he meant it. And honestly, it was just like one sentence. And I mean, I was going to do anything I could to, like, get to him. And I actually did make it to the second session. But I say that because, there are these moments, and people have such good BS meters, but it doesn't need to take that long to sort of show that person that you care, show that person, even with me pulling the guy to the side and telling him about the fly, like, is he going to now trust me better that, like, I'm going to look out for him, right? Versus what if I let him go on stage?
I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, the thoughts afterwards where he has to sort of rationalize this choice that someone else did without any of the context. And I mean, talk about the stereotypical misunderstanding right there waiting to happen.
100%. Yeah. And, we've all been sort of on that other side of why didn't they tell me? And very often it's like, and so that motivates me. That really does motivate me.
Fair
Interesting.
enough. Fair enough.
One thing, Amy, I wanted to discuss. Kim decided to choose boss in her book, and she was mentioning that some preconceived notion when it's come to terms like manager versus leader. Sometimes it it comes with some preconceived notion that leaders doesn't do anything, manager doesn't lead. And she gave example that in one of the biography for Andy Grove, they was mentioning management and leadership is backhand and forehand, that you need to be really good at both of them to be really good. Tell us more why she chose boss and how we need to resolve this preconceived notion within the organization large, not only for these two terms, but for so many terms.
Yeah, well, that's a big question. And I will say one of the things I love about Kim, I mean, I was an English major, like a literature major. And then when I went to business school, had to take some accounting and finance to catch up. So I think Kim and I both share a deep appreciation for words. And I'm aware also, like, what are your kind of your original languages? Like, English is my first language. So I'm curious, like, for each of
Farsi,
you.
my first language.
Farsi, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Afrikaans for me.
Afrikaans, right? So, that to me is fascinating, even just how words kind of change our thinking. Like I spent, when I was in film school, I spent 6 months in Paris, and luckily I could write my screenplay in English, but the course was in French. And I would joke, I was like, I'm really pretty funny in English, but in French, I was like the most boring person alive, right? And so it's so interesting. So I'm just mindful that even those words, first of all, like I'm speaking as someone who, went to business school and grew up in the US, and sort of that's my version of English, and you all are mediating it. So I think that's first of all, that's something really kind of important to name. And then I'm also coming from, being a woman going to business school, and any image of boss I ever saw was, a white man. And so the words also have like all of those other layers, right? And so I don't know what it's like to, move through the world coming from South Africa or having Farsi. So I'm just kind of naming even just those differences when we come to the words. So the other word that I want to bring in, and we can talk about it too, is feedback, right? Because we do a lot of workshops on feedback, and I'll put a slide up at the top, and I'll have the word feedback and question mark. And people, I'll say just off the top of your head, and some people will be like, it's a gift. And then some people will be like, it's horrifying. And, and so just all of the kind of baggage around these words. So I want to just acknowledge, maybe, like, what a great question that is. I think with the choice of the word boss, for me, there's something a little like Kim wants to be as informal as possible. And so there's something about like manager and leader that sound very like, now I'm getting my briefcase and I'm going to work. And, there's no perfect word, just like feedback is not the best word, but that's sort of the word in the marketplace. But I do think what's important is that, certainly I see everyone as a leader, whether we have like official hierarchical influence or not. We certainly have the ability to lead through example, to wherever I am in a relationship, whether it's peer-to-peer, up, down, sideways, I can start by asking for feedback. I personally can put radical candor into practice. So that's kind of thing one. And I think in terms of management, like there's a lot of things about management that have been given short shrift, and that are important, whether it's about creating efficiency, about managing resources successfully. Like there is a value to that. I think the problem becomes when we then ascribe value to humans, and then by the fact that you are in this hierarchical position, you're somehow, better, quote unquote, than another person. And that's something I really appreciate about Kim, which is the humanity, which is like, even if this quote job might not be the right job for you, like it doesn't mean you're a bad person. Let's match up. And that's where a really good manager, let's find based on your skills and based on the resource, like let's match that up. And so I think that's where management can really be a big service.
I know.
Yeah, I
And
think
that,
for me, it's sort of very interesting. So my background normally comes in the buzzword is virtual organization. So I work in sort of things like governance, where it's not really direct management, but you've got to build these fictional organizational structures with people sort of within your organization that can support each other. And language is just the hardest thing because a word is not a word is not a word, depending on who you speak to at that specific point in time. So what I really appreciated about the book is you do get that sense, Amy, like you've mentioned, this linguistic side of it where it's constantly being repeated and it sets the frame for you so that when you need to speak to someone about being a manager with their responsibilities, it I've got some like new terms that I can essentially, yeah, I spoke to Mary about this as well. There's so many anecdotal information that you can pull out of the book that adds context where people might misrepresent that sort of like with it in the sort of like the organization as well. Um, one of the things that I really want to bring out is emotional or sort of like it's this emotional labor. When I read that, it's sort of like one of the things that I struggle with a lot because people tend to not be able to quantify or name the things that they do. They're just like, I had 50 meetings today. I'm absolutely exhausted, but what kind of labor did you put into it? So emotional labor, the term was, it's something that I'm going to take out of this book and definitely start using quite a lot because it brings to light a lot of this background effort that needs to happen when we talk about being a boss, being a manager, being a leader. This that you need to sort of like I can't remember exactly what the startup was that Kim was mentioning, but where it still resonates with me, where she walked in, she's got the pricing that she needs to figure out, and then all of a sudden she has these people that she's directly responsible for, and the emotional shift between a very sad situation, a very happy situation, um, that really, really resonates. And again, it just hits the point home so hard.
Yeah, there was a great, I think when she was with, starting up Juice Software a while back, and, somebody had, there was a great victory, then there was a health issue, and she felt like she was going back and forth, and she talks to her coach, and I feel like I'm babysitting, and she's like, this is your job,
yeah.
it's like, this is what it means to be a manager. And I think it's so important, I've been teaching emotional intelligence and mindfulness-based emotional intelligence for a long time. And I personally would not be in a place to be teaching radical candor had I not done all of this work around self-awareness, emotional management, because so much of this requires, before we can have the sort of space and bandwidth to show up as a manager and leader for the people that we work with and that work for us, I need to put my own oxygen mask on myself, and I need to, they are going to pick up on what I'm putting down. And by the way, it can be very invisible, but people know. Somebody walks in a room, it could be, far away, and this person's in a bad mood, or, and you're going to stay away. And so there are these ripple effects. And so I think, the best leaders I have found are the ones who have done that kind of work, and they do have that self-awareness, and they do realize, oh, this is a time for me to take a step back. Or when someone's having a big moment, we talk a lot about in these real-time conversations. One of the biggest things that might happen is that somebody might get sad or they might get angry. And then how do you show up and how do you respond? And I think, first of all, realizing like that's okay if there's an emotion. Like, I think somehow people think like, oh, it was a bad conversation because the person got upset. It's like, no, it's a human conversation. They're invested in it. Maybe you
Agreed.
had mentioned about don't take it personally. Like, that's one of our big lines is we try not to be too didactic to, to say like, do say this, don't say this. We try not to do that. But that's one of those phrases we say, please don't say that, because if somebody says to you, oh, don't take it personally, it's completely minimizing your emotional react. Like, you're going to have whatever emotional reaction you're going to have. By the way,
Yeah.
we want you, and you just spent 6 months on this project. Like, you're invested, So what's more important is, how can I show up for you in that moment? And
Hmm.
have I, sort of built up my own capacity, so that whether if you're really upset or you're really frustrated, that I can create that space. It doesn't mean that I'm never going to go out on the challenge with you, but this is not the moment. What's
Yeah.
going to matter most in that moment is, can I meet that emotion with compassion? What is most helpful for that person? And one of the things, and I recommend this for your listeners, with the people that you work with, it can be very helpful to have conversations when you're not in those conversations. So basically, like, if you're feeling a strong emotion, what would be most helpful for you? Or what have people done that you appreciated? So for example, like, I'm someone who, I like to talk about it and process it. And, Kim doesn't want to do that. Kim's like, if she's feeling a strong emotion, she just kind of wants to barrel through it. So we know that about each other. And we know that if we're in a conversation, what's going to be sort of almost, what's going to look like care personally to me is going to look very different for Kim. And one of the biggest mistakes that we tend to make is we show up for the other person the way we want to have someone show up for us, but that could land really poorly for that person. So get to
Yeah.
know the people you work with.
I
Great.
think just an anecdotal story from my end. So I did have a very um, a very fortunate situation with my very first manager that I worked for. Absolutely amazing guy, but he used to be a essentially a climbing guide for the Alps. Pretty much every peak that you can think of, he's either climbed or wants to climb. And the way he would approach me as a junior in the technology environment that's very stressed, very eager to please, I now have a vocabulary that I can sort of speak about that. And it was very much about this radical candor, that empathy from his end that was both addressing a issue, but then also giving that sort of like that caring aspect to it as well. Um, Absolutely amazing. I don't have the words to sort of describe it as well.
Yeah, well, but you have the emotion, and I think that's why, we'll have people often think about, because when you actually start to try to break it down, and I think that's what's happening for you, it can be very helpful. So one of the things that we do in our events, and then when I train people to train it at their companies, is I invite people to think about their own radical candor stories. And so, just to make sure that we sort of do paint that picture of what good looks like. I had a boss, and very often the stories that we tell end up being a boss giving or manager leader, but we'll use
Yeah.
boss, right? We've sort of landed on boss. A boss giving us criticism. Those tend to be the moments that stick with us, right? But again, to be really clear, it's even more about, like, the boss soliciting the feedback, especially the criticism, and even more about praise. But we don't always remember those stories. I had recently graduated from Harvard Business School, so I thought I was the greatest thing that had ever come to management and leadership and bossdom, et cetera. And I had a little to learn about humility. And my background was in marketing, and we had just launched this new website, and we had a meeting with the CEO and the CFO. And after the meeting, my boss, Steve, he was the chief marketing officer. He asked, how I thought the meeting went. And I was walking on air. I was so happy. I was like, we got this new brand project that I really wanted. And the CEO was getting great feedback from the board. And CFO was really happy from the numbers coming in under budget. So I was like, this was the best. And Steve nodded. He was really patient. And then he said, what do you think Brooke and Jenny thought of the meeting? And I was like, they thought the meeting was great. I didn't really give it a second thought. And then he said, Amy, did you notice that the CEO asked Jenny about the content strategy, and she started talking and you interrupted her? And I got really defensive, and I said, yeah, I did interrupt her because, she was rambling, and the CEO's a
Hmm.
really busy guy. Like, we got to go. And I kind of thought that was that. And then, Steve was very patient. He said, Amy, did you notice also the CFO asked Brooke about the numbers, and they were right in front of Brooke on the table, but you didn't even let him answer?
Hmm.
And all of a sudden at that point, I just felt this huge pit in my stomach of just like utter horror and shame.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you guys are like me, you don't like to make mistakes, but I'm definitely, at the time I was just a perfectionist. Now I'm a recovering perfectionist. And I just was started feeling terror because then he said, did you notice what was happening the last 10 minutes of the meeting? And all of a sudden I realized I had no idea. He's like, Brooke looked like he was going to throw something. He was furious. Jenny looked like she wanted to be anywhere but there. I'm afraid you're going to lose your team. Go check in on them. And, I share that story because it did not feel great in the moment. Like I'm a very sensitive person. I don't love, like it sort of, but thank God, because they were really upset with me. And going back to that ruinous empathy, how much easier would it have been for Steve to just, Amy's so sensitive, I don't want to say anything,
Fair
and
enough.
so I think, and part of what's really important is what I like to do when we share our story, and this might be even, Willem, when you think about that, climbing guide, like what was care personally and challenged directly, both in the conversation and also going back, maybe even what you were saying about sort of building the relationship. What were those kind of deposits in the relationship bank? So in the conversation, not only did he say, go check in on the team, but he did tell me, he's like, I know you can be a great manager, but a
Hmm.
great manager lets their people shine. And so there's something, when we do these storytelling exercises, a lot of what people say that sort of care personally looks like is they took the time
Hmm.
and they showed they were invested in that person's success and they painted a picture of what was possible. And there were a few things. And when Kim tells a story about, her boss at Google, she talks about what care personally looked like for her. For me with Steve, like I had been traveling, a very heavy door fell on me. And he stayed on the phone with me like all night because I had a concussion. But
Wow.
even more meaningful, and that was really meaningful, I was one of the first 30 people to be accepted to a program from Google called Search Inside Yourself. It was a mindfulness leadership program on an emotional intelligence. But this was over 10 years ago, so mindfulness was not a thing. And my company was like, we're not paying for it. But
Very new
Steve,
ground.
yeah, it was very new. So Steve, he knew how important it was to me. He found budget. And so for me, that was a way of showing like this is important to Amy for Amy and for Amy's growth. And so I knew he was really like literally invested in me. So even though that feedback was really hard to hear, I think maybe going back to your point of like, what are those things along the way? How are we showing up with these folks that show that we are invested in their success? And we're going to, focus on what's working well. We're going to solicit feedback, but we're also not going to hesitate to tell them when they made a mistake.
Yep. And one of the stories that in this book, when she wanted to articulate radical candor, Kim wanted to articulate this, was the story of her and her dog. And a stranger really show her what is radical candor is. That in few sentences mention, hey, I can see that you love your dog, but if you don't teach him how to behave, he might die. And he said, if any other way he would approach me, I would have not take his advice and take it personally. But the way that he approached me and she showed me how to do it, and she just said sit to the dog, and the dog sat at that moment, was a lesson that she take from that encounter. And although in some scenario there is no relationship built, but people they can make really a good impact in your life. This is something that is really priceless, I believe.
I think it's such a great story. She's such a great storyteller. I think we can sort of all visualize that moment. And again, to your point, like it doesn't need to take that long. And people can like she could feel that when he said, I see you really love that dog. Like, and that was all it took. I had a similar thing. I was doing a workshop and I'm left-handed, and so I'm someone like a lot of stuff will like get on my hand when I'm writing. And so this woman, we had a break, and this woman, she pulled me to the side. So she did it privately. So when we criticize, to do it privately, she said,
Hmm.
Amy, I love the workshop. I'm getting so much out of it. And I could tell she meant it. She really was engaged. She said, I did want to let you know, because I would want to know, you have magic marker all over your chin. And that was all she had to say. Like sometimes we think like, oh, we have to fix the problem. No, I mean, sometimes we can't always fix it, and so but she actually had one of those travel mirrors, and she's like, see, and I mean, there was like magic marker all over my chin, and so thank God. But for me also, the way she's like, because I would want to know, like it was like the person, she was doing it to be helpful, and like that was and so those are those moments. So to your point, like it can be quick, we can connect, we can show the care, and we can be helpful and be clear.
On the other side of the spectrum, her experience with Larry Page, the way that she sent out an email, obnoxious aggression email to Larry Page, and accusing him that he is like really want to go for the money, not really care about the client, and seeing Larry Page as demigod. She was mentioning that if it was a person that was reporting to me, I would never ever do that. But I see my boss or Larry Page as demigod, that I can hit them with anything, and they don't really get offended or get hurt. Uh, and it's happening quite a lot when you get to that position. Sometimes people, they feel like because they're underdog or anything, they have a right to treat you that way, right?
Yeah, I think the phrase, I don't know if this translate, but uh, it's like just because you don't want to kick down, sort of be obnoxious to your team member, it also doesn't give you permission to sort of kick up. And I had a very similar story where I wrote this email. I was so frustrated. I was on this technology project, and I was doing the research, and nobody was looking at the research, and I felt like nobody was listening to me. And so I wrote this email, and I may have sent it to the chairman of the board saying how the project owner was wasting millions of dollars by not listening to my research. And, similar to Kim's, no, it's very interesting because similar to Kim's story, it was satisfying to write, but it was really obnoxious. It's still a human being there. That is the primary point. And so not only are we invalidating kind of the humanity of that person, but then often what happens after we've done that very obnoxious thing is that rather than going the right direction, like moving up on care personally, we end up going the other direction, which is we back down on the challenge. And so she continues to tell the story about how then she tries like the false apology and, oh, I didn't mean it. And it's like, no, she did mean it. And he's like, what's even worse is like I think it's like he treated her like, someone who just like bird poop on the shoulder or something. And I did a similar thing, because often what happens after we've acted like such a jerk. So like I was still at the same organization. This technology project was still going on, and there was a new project owner. I was no longer on the project, but this person comes into a meeting and says, the reason this project failed was because there was no research. And I'm sitting in this meeting and I'm just like, I spent a few years doing the research. I spent a few more years trying to talk about the research, and now I am just done. And so I was like, oh, okay, good luck with that. And, I think it's really important to share stories when we've landed in this quadrant, manipulative insincerity, because it can be kind of fun to tell stories when we've acted like a jerk and wrote the really obnoxious email. And it can be, look how great I am. I care so much. I didn't want to hurt their feelings. This quadrant can feel a little icky, and I think when I look at why did I act that way, because it's so contrary to my values, there can be a time when maybe we need to be protective of ourselves. Like maybe if there was some bullying or something, there can be a valid reason sometimes while we land there. And for me, it really forced me to kind of look at myself and be like, if I'm going to stay in this organization, like what do I need to do to sort of fill myself back up? Because I think I was so burnt out at that time. And so I think when we start acting, it's just a really good kind of reflection on, what can I change of how I'm showing up. And by the way, often with these stories is that we realize I'm going to do things a little differently the next time. So a few years later, I was in a new job, and my tendency would have been like, why are these people doing this thing? It seems so stupid, right? And it's like, well, hey, maybe you should ask and like listen rather than jumping to assumptions like this other person. And so that was one of the best gifts I think I ever got. Very often when we're new, and it's great often when we're new because we can sort of see what's broken, and maybe people there have been trying, and it was just like a very humbling thing to be like, you know what, start by listening, start by asking questions. So that was a really great gift.
It'll be quite interesting for me is so when you have a moment like this, what lens would you normally try to look at the situation through? So specifically, there's a lot of context about relationships, trust, and culture. Do you tend to sort of like weigh these elements with regard to the situation, and or how do you sort of sit back and do that retrospective sort of element?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think the word retrospective is a really good one. And I think, you know, a lot of just from my own personal experience, I think the world has changed, and the commitment to more collaborative working environments versus sort of command and control top down. I've certainly been in organizational cultures, 15, 20 years ago, where a whole culture might not have been committed to radical candor. It might have been very top down. And so I think in those cases, it's much more almost, we talk about almost like pockets of excellence where like
Hmm.
I might not, get my boss's boss and my boss, like that might be out of my range, but certainly with my peers, certainly with my team, if I've got direct reports, I can start to practice radical candor with a few people. And so when I look back in some of those cultures that I was in where it maybe didn't feel safe and there wasn't as much, it was much more hierarchical, and you sort of had to have, this C-suite person talk to that C-suite person, right? But what do I have agency over? So that's always sort of how I look at it. And I think sometimes when you're in a culture that may not be practicing radical candor, it can feel really lonely. And so one of the things that we've actually done is we've created a community where people can join it. I think the URL is community.radicalcandor.com, but where people can actually talk to other people. So let's say you're the person trying to bring radical candor to your company and you read the book, or there's just a few of you. But I think, it can be hard when you're sort of the one at the front end of that change. And so I think finding just a couple people, in your org, or, maybe you've got this or that peer, just starting small, because I think sometimes, when you think about like, oh my gosh, I can't change the whole culture, but you can, change a few relationships.
Very true, very true. And that, what I hear that as we discuss about it, relation cannot scale, but culture it does. And
Yep.
also, the Kim quote, I don't know, one statement that is culture eat a strategy for lunch. Can you
Yeah.
elaborate on
I
that?
think that may be, I think Peter Drucker
Drucker,
maybe
I
is like
believe, right?
a business, and it may be breakfast or lunch. It's one of those meals. I'm not sure. I'll have to check the Google. But yeah, I mean, I think that's much more just about, and this goes even with management and leadership. And I think, so much of what we talk about, sort of building a culture of radical candor. And by the way, it doesn't mean there's not strategy. And, part of it, there's a big part of the book. How do you make decisions? How do you get the right people into the right spots? How do you have more efficient meetings? I mean, there's a lot around strategy, but I think certainly, if there was certainly a tradition when I was in business school of like hard skills and calling these sort of human stuff the soft skills. And I don't
Mm.
think that's the right framing. I think it's the
Oh yeah.
essential skills, and they
Yes.
can even be some of the hardest stuff, because if you have a great strategy and if this person's not talking to that person because they're really pissed off, or this person's really burnt out, and so they're just going to put in the minimum effort.
Oh
And
yeah.
if people are not performing, I think there's data around people leaving, their managers not, they're going to
Mm.
stay for their great managers. So I think it's very much about, focusing on the human. We still have to get results. I think the beauty of radical candor, the sort of hypothesis, and what we find is that by having these better conversations, these more candid, caring conversations, you're going to build better relationships and you're going to get better results. And so I think that's the offer on hand, is that, they're all interrelated.
Right, right. And another things that I really, really like about this book regarding growth management framework, that people that are in the steep growth trajectory and gradual growth trajectory, so-called rock star and superstar. I really like the way that she really bring it to the picture, and it was also correlating with her different state of life. That in this state I was superstar, in the other state I
Mhm.
was rock star. I wanted to have stability and more work-life balance.
Yeah, I think it's a great insight. And just to be clear, when she talks about rock star, she's talking like sort of Rock of Gibraltar. Even, and just this idea, there are these like folks on your team, these sort of solid, like doing a great job day in, day out. They're not necessarily looking to be, the CEO, but they're really essential. And I think Kim's point, there's so much self-awareness there. Certainly when you go to Harvard Business School and you get this message and you're, maybe in your late 20s or early 30s, or, starting out, and it's like, go, 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 best, 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 CEO, CEO. And I think part of the realization is like, you need this balance. You need this balance of people who are on this like really steep growth trajectory, who are just going thing to thing to thing. And then there's also the real value and the importance of the people who, the day in, day out, they're looking for stability. And I think this can be a function of career, it can be a function of, whether it's going through COVID, whether people are building families, whether they're caretaking for older
Yeah.
family members, whether they're having health issues, maybe they're trying to launch, their music career, And so this idea that when people are showing up as humans, and I think Kim's realization in the book that she was kind of judging the folks that maybe were not on as steep a growth trajectory because she hadn't had it. And then she realized like, oh, A, I actually need it. And B, we're all going to be on those different trajectories in different times in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just would like to thank Kim for actually bringing this up, because again, this is you always walk into an organization. Spent my first couple of years of my career consulting, where you can clearly see the rock stars, and normally it is again a very, very you know, they're left alone. We used to joke about something called the mushrooms. You keep them in the basement and feed them shit, and that's pretty much the rock stars, right? They just keep the light on for you, and it's so disheartening to sort of see
Mm.
the value attached to them. And now having this new framework, just to talk a little bit more about it, and this very clear distinction between the two, it's so liberating, because it's just about framing. And now, because you have the term rock stars there with this very solid definition behind it, it just helps when I need to have conversations with human resources, when I need to have conversations about architecture, long-term strategic planning. It's the fact that you couldn't really contextualize rock stars. And this sort of very much adds a lot of tools to my tool belt to sort of have a conversation, or a constructive conversation about that.
Yeah, I think having the frame, having the example, and I just go back to so much of when you think about radical candor is about being kind and clear. And so
Mm.
the challenge directly dimension, for me, in many ways, it's about being more and more clear. And I think, am I clear even to the point of a rock star of like, what does good look like in a job? Like very often, are our job descriptions clear? Like, have we identified like, this is what good looks like, this is what success looks like? And it really forces us as managers, and as we're organizing and structuring things, like, have I laid those things out? Very often, there's misalignment on what those expectations are, and
Very much, yeah.
what is meets expectations and exceeds expectations. And I think the other part, and again, just to go back to the humanity, Mehdi, which you mentioned in the book title, is that, there's something, certainly in American culture, I think somewhat, maybe just in tech or in other industries, but there are almost these value judgments, like some jobs are more important than others and some performances are more important than others. And so I think there's very much this sense of just valuing valuing work. And, in the book, Kim has, I think, the story of, painting the chapel. And some people see it as sort of like a day's work, and other people, it's like a path to, to the divine. And so I think there's also just this very individualized sense of different people are going to, show up at work and meet their work in ways that matter to them. And my role is, how can I understand each person on my team and understand what sort of the meaning of work is. And by the way, a fine meaning is earning a salary to take care of my life. And that is more than enough, right?
Very true. Very true. Also,
Yeah.
one of the things that it came to my attention, also Jack Welch in his book Winning have this framework of 20, 70, 10. 20 being superstar, 70 being rock star, and 10 or those people that are not meant for the job. The way that uh, Kim was mentioning is not the person that is sucks, is the job that is sucks for this person.
That's
And
right.
exactly the same way Jack Welch also was mentioning that, hey, this 10%, they are not in the right position. You are not doing only the organization a favor, you're doing them a favor. But you need to also empower them, try to find them good position, not only just getting rid of them.
Absolutely. And there's a moment, and I think it's really well laid out in the book in terms of, and we don't like putting people in boxes, but knowing sort of where somebody is on their trajectory. And there's a lot of, sort of manager look yourself in the eye of like, have I set this person up for success? Have I been having career conversations with them? Have I matched up their skill set with the opportunity? And if there's not a trajectory for where they can go, then yes, I am doing them no disservice. And am I avoiding that conversation because of my going back to the difficult conversation? Have I been clear about what this role looks like? And have I really been stepping up to, make sure that they're in the best spot for them? So really well said, Mehdi.
Thank you. And one thing that I really find it interesting when she mentioned was she was mentioning once someone told him only 5% of people having vocation, which really is make everybody confuse the shit out of everybody else. That's the way that she put it. And she also mentioned about this story of people that they was working, as the first person, what are you doing? So I'm working. The second person was saying I building a wall, and the third person was saying I'm building a cathedral of Almighty. And but she was mentioning only 5% they have this vocation.
Absolutely. There's another author I'm a big fan of, Elizabeth Gilbert. She wrote the book Eat, Pray, Love. But she's talked a lot recently about, sort of this purpose anxiety, and you have to find your purpose and find that one
Very much.
thing that's going to change the world. And,
You're gonna be
it's like,
happy.
oh my, right. And so, for me, I'm very much about, and she talks about this too, just like being in the present. And I think that allows me like, something I can manage that. Like, what would be the sort of the best use of my hour? How lovely to spend this time having a conversation with you. And also that gives me permission to change, right? Like, and going back to the rock star superstar, like maybe, something comes up and I'm, health or other things, and I'm not going to have as much time. So I think just that sort of meeting each moment, being present, being curious. It doesn't mean that we don't have sort of, long-term visions, but I think just, gosh, we are so hard on ourselves. Like we have to have it all figured out. And again, we're living in uncertain times. And I think just sometimes being able to meet that uncertainty with some compassion, just doing the best you can, earning a paycheck and doing something kind for another person, like, my gosh, that feels like a pretty good day,
Yeah.
Very true.
Just allowing yourself to just be slightly normal. I think
Yeah.
what is wrong with that from time to time?
I know. I know. And
But I think that phrase purpose anxiety really spoke to me because there's always been this sort of buzzing. It's almost been like the backdrop soundtrack to my life of like, should be doing something more. Where's sort of that more? And there's some value to that of like, if we have certain goals that we want to, so it's like, for me, it's kind of holding both of those. It's like I can have these sort of goals at the same time of like really appreciating this moment and sort of doing our best. I recently gave a TEDx talk. It hasn't come out yet. We're at sort of early March, so it should come out in the next month or so. But it was really neat to have, one of those like big ticket item goals. And that felt really great. And so I think there's just that holding of, having something that we might be sort of aspiring to at the same time of just, wow, like I did my best today. That's pretty good.
Good enough, right?
Yeah.
Good enough.
Exactly. Right. And Emmy, like Kim was mentioning that when she wanted to join Apple, she consulted with Andy Grove. How Kim know Andy Grove? And like it was quite interesting that Andy Grove was mentioning that Steve always get it fucking right. And he said, "What do you mean he's always right?" He said, "No, I didn't say he's always right. He's always getting it right. He challenged people to challenge him. And if he say, hey, do this, and you know that is wrong, he come to you and shout at you, hey, why we went that direction?" And said, because you said so, I hire you to tell me when I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. I think that idea of like getting it right, that's really the goal. We're a small team at Radical Candor, and the goal is sort of less about the sort of person and more about like what's going to be the best iteration of the idea. Kim will often say when she sends something like as a writer, like our job is more important as the editor. It's like sort of going in there with writing. And I think there's another leader I really admire. Alan Mulally. You may have heard of him. He was the CEO of Ford. And he tells a story. Kim actually kind of has a version of this, which I'll get to. But he tells a story where he recently, when he got to Ford, I don't remember if what year exactly. This was a while back. And they were losing millions and millions of dollars. But people, his reports would come into these status meetings and every index would be green. And so he's like, something's wrong here. We're losing all this money, but everyone keeps showing up green. And so he really challenged them, like, come to the meeting, like, tell me what's wrong. And it's like, so then another meeting and everyone's green. He's like, no, really, like, what's happening here? So the next meeting, someone shows up and has a red, and he just celebrated that. And he was like, this is so great. And because people were afraid to like talk about what was going wrong, but he knew there was a problem because they were losing millions of dollars. And so part of, the leader's role of like having people come and tell you what's wrong. Kim told a story where she got some feedback like, Kim, you're so intimidating. People don't want to tell you stuff. And she's like, little old me, I'm not intimidating. And, and they're like, well, I'm going to give you a test. Tell your team to, set some like ridiculous goal. There's no way they could ever achieve it, and see what happens in the meeting if they push back. And so she did it and nobody said anything. And so
that's a good litmus test.
She's like, oh dear, like maybe I need to start building some more safety there. So I think those are really, really instructive stories. And of like, I think I'm creating a place where people can push back, et cetera. But if I'm not getting that pushback in the meetings, maybe, we need to revisit.
Fair enough. I mean, coming back to, I think you really mentioned it when you have these kind of meetings and adding that little 5 minutes right at the end, just to do a bit of testing. Is this something that you sort of, these little moments of change, and I think the book speaks about this as well, not a big bang, just these slight little steps. Is this something you also use to then sort of test the waters to see if your reality matches up with everybody else's reality around the table?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Radical Candor is really the first organization I've been in where, people are practicing radical candor. So I'll often, and, we're all virtual. We actually just had our first offsite in like 5 years. So we met some new folks. I'll send Kim will send me a text. Hey, got a few minutes to chat. We'll have a quick chat. I'll send a text or a Slack, and I'll just check in with someone, and then we'll have a live conversation. We want to do this in live conversations, but even just those pulse checks are so important. Also, because I don't want to be worrying all night, as I might like. I said it this way. Should I have said it? Oh my gosh, they hate me. Now what? Like, what's gonna? So just like. So we do this all the time. I had, and then I assume we'll be wrapping up soon, but I had a funny story where maybe your listeners can relate to it. Jason is my boss. He's our CEO, Kim's co-founder. And we have, I think the best relationship I've ever had with a boss, and lots of trust, lots of care. And we were working on a project, and I got this message in Slack because we have a weekly one-on-one. And he said, we're traveling a lot. We're not able to meet this week. I want to find time to meet this week. I have some thoughts. And yeah, Willem, that your face, I don't know if people are watching a video, but it was like a murder mystery music just like went on in the background for me. And I was just like, my mindset was like, well, I had a good run at Radical Candor. It went pretty well. I mean, I thought it was going well, but I guess not. And it was just like worst case scenario, right? I have a very strong negativity bias. So I like to practice meditation. So I was like, well, just sit with it for a day or so. And then we had the meeting, and he checked in. He asked how the project was going, and there was some concerns that I'd had, and I was really curious to get his perspective, and he had great ideas. I mean, it really didn't even feel like criticism, because it was just like, oh, how about this? And, it was exactly what was on my mind. And he had some really great ads. So it was a fantastic conversation. Then at the end, I said, Jason, never again. I have thoughts. And he cracked up because he said he edited that message multiple times in Slack. But I share that because I think we can relate. Like if we don't have like a baked in meeting, like how do you even set up the meeting? And, just even, that's why I like to have these meetings, like having the one-on-ones already set up. We know there's a time, or even just checking in. Hey, you have a few minutes to check in. How, I said it would have been fine to just be like, hey, I'd love to check in, hear how you think the project is going. Like that would have been great. But different people, like Kim, might not have minded. I have thoughts, like different things are going to land differently for different people.
But most definitely, I would have loved to say that I would never had that message ever before, and it ended up in exactly the same situation, but I would be lying. Oh my goodness. Oh, the nervousness.
That was a great story. Thanks for sharing, Amy.
You're welcome.
We are running out of time. Is there any things, Willem, you want to bring out before we close?
No, actually, I just want to say thank you. I mean, really, Radical Candor as a book opened up a lot of new interesting ways for me to sort of explain the world around me, especially how I function within organizations and enterprises. And one of the things, as I was reading through the book, there was definitely this very strong sense of a very core South African value that I absolutely loved. So after our very tumultuous past, we had Nelson Mandela that stepped up to the plate. One of the very first things that he introduced is sort of like the spirit of Ubuntu.
Oh,
And this
yes.
whole concept of I am because we are, it feels it sort of embodies this book. So it spoke to me just culturally very, very much. So 2 thumbs up. Thank you so much for just putting this out there. Not just the book itself, but actually driving this. And I mean, if I could recommend the readers, go to the site, have a look at the foundation. I mean, even the resources that you have there, Amy, beautiful. You could definitely see someone with a background in storytelling had a hand in this.
Yes. Well, kudos to, we've got Brandy on our team doing the marketing, and Kim for writing the book. Willem, I am so touched. Ubuntu is, I have been to South Africa. The phrase means a lot to me. I'm really touched. And the way you closed is actually, I think one of the best ways people can start to put this into practice, which is through that specific and sincere praise. What does Radical Candor, why is it meaningful for you? Now I learned a little bit more about what matters to you that would help build my relationship with you. So those are the ways we can really start to build those relationships. Yeah, I encourage people, go check out radicalcandor.com. There's lots of free content there, our podcast, and as well, if you want to, join that community.radicalcandor.com. But there's lots of ways, in addition to the workshops we do, where people can interact and access a bunch of content in addition to the fantastic book that, for me, I've read multiple times, never gets old, and I love hearing how it resonates with you, Willem, as well, Mehdi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a really amazing book. I've been through the audiobook several times, and I'm going to through the new edition again as well. There are so many
Great.
other...
I'll tell Kim. I know what Kim would say. She would say it makes, like, sitting alone in a room for 4 long years, it makes it worthwhile. It really does. It means a lot. I know. I'll share the kudos for her, because it was a labor of love, and so to hear how impactful it was means a lot.
It was, and for sure we're gonna have another episode about radical candor, because I didn't even finish half of the point that I wanted to discuss about in this episode. That's what I'm talking about. People, please go and get this book.
But there's also another book as well that we need to now read. It's the Radical...
There is, yeah. So it's called Radical Respect. It's a follow-up.
That's the one.
So another way of thinking about radical candor is compassionate candor. So that's kind of thing one. And then radical respect is really what happens when bias, prejudice, and bullying come into the equation, when power comes into the equation. In many ways, it's a prequel to radical candor, because if we don't have that respect, right? If we don't have that spirit of, I see you as a fellow human being, we owe each other that common human decency. So in some ways, it's a prequel that we need to have that respect. And in some ways, it's kind of a 2.0, what do we do? How can we create more respectful workplaces, more, bias, prejudice, bullying-free workplaces where people can, get great work done and treat each other with respect.
Thank you so much for the sneak peek. Really, I'm looking forward to reading it.
Same here. Same here.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, Amy. It was wonderful to have you on this episode. And thanks, everybody, for listening to our podcast. Looking forward to bring another nice book and another nice episode for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet you both. Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
Right. Cheers.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.